Great, well, it's really good to see you all this evening. I hope you should have some measly effort at sweets. If you're in lads group, that's been topped up a little bit. If you're in girls group, you didn't get any sweets, because I was told you get epic amount of sweets, which I see is the case, and so you're all alright for a bit of sugar sustenance this evening. Thank you all very much for joining us. I know it's kind of tight in here. I did contemplate moving us into the other room, and then I thought, well, lads group need to play cricket beforehand, don't they? So we might have to rethink how we fit everyone in, but it's great to see so many. If you can't see past the pillar, feel free to move at various points with all that's going on, but hopefully we can all grab a seat. Now, we're considering the question up on the screen here, where is God in my suffering? So I want to kick off with some lyrics. Okay, now here's your question. Name the band, finish the lyric. Okay, so people killing, people dying, children hurt and hear them crying, and then it kind of goes on. Father, 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 help us. I mean, discuss in your groups if you want, but the band, who wrote it and how does it finish? And then we'll get answers in a moment. Okay, that's probably long enough. The easier part. Who wants to name? Who wants to name the group? Who wrote it? Black Eyed Peas. Yeah. I mean, Kathy, well done for putting your hand up. Tim, you got it right, but we need decorum. Hands up. Who wants to finish the lyric off?
Tim does.
Anyone have a go? Go on then, Hannah.
Where is the love?
Yeah, a bit more than that. We'll go to the middle.
Help us. Need some guidance from above. People got me questioning where is the love.
Yeah, very good. So send some guidance from above, because people got me questioning, where is the love? Now this great. I hope you've got that from where it's going. Because did you see the point in the song? It's quite an old song now. I can't remember how old it is. Still around. We've heard this song. Yeah? No? The younger ones never heard of it. Some nods from people who are.
Sing it to us, Ed.
Say again, Jill.
Sing it.
Sing it to you. I'll sing it to you later. Jill. All right. So it kind of picks up. We're going to talk about this. Just the idea that we see suffering in our world, and what that causes us to do is question, well, if God's a loving God, well, where's He involved in this? What is going on? What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for a little bit, split you into groups at a couple of points to discuss things, and then we're going to have plenty of time at the end for question and answer, both discussion in your groups, but also question and answer from the front. What I want to talk through is just, as we think through this particular question, is we see suffering in the world, don't we? I mean, if you want to dispute that, some worldviews will come on to dispute that, but we see great suffering in our world. It's everywhere. There's lots of different forms of it. But as we see that, it's got me questioning a God in that. Where is the love in that particular case? And we see suffering, switch on our news, go on our news apps, from the kind of end of a screen. We also see it deeply in our lives and the lives of loved ones, don't we? For those of you who've been coming on a Sunday morning, we partly picked this big questions to tie in with the Sunday morning. We're looking at a book of the Bible that considers suffering. That's the book of Job. And in the first in a series on that, I mentioned about going to a funeral of a friend of mine who committed suicide, and the person taking the service saying, well, today's not a day for preaching, it's a day for reflection. Now, at one level, I want to understand what that's saying. You don't want to be kind of going in heavy-handed as if you've got all the answers in that situation. But now I do want to say that Christianity has no answers to that. Because the problem is, in our reflection, in great sadness, that can leave us in despair in that. And where I think we get to with this is that the major objection in Christianity, we see great suffering, here's how the reasoning goes, I think. So God is loving. If God is loving, which is on this side here, if God is loving, He wants to do something about all that suffering in the world. As a parent, if you see your child suffering, you don't just, if you can do something about it, you don't just go, oh, tough. Well, do something about it as a loving parent. And if God is powerful, all powerful, he could do something about it. So you've got the two parts to it. He should, if he's loving, he'd want to do something about it. If he's powerful, he could do something about it. And therefore, with those two things of a loving God and a powerful God, if there is suffering in the world, it causes me to question. The Black Eyed Peas goes, well, where's the love? Is there actually a loving God? It might be you end up questioning, well, he's not powerful. He's there, he wants to do something about it, but he can't. It probably gets us questioning one of those two, or we end up going, I just don't believe in that God that's presented in the Bible as one who's all loving and who's all powerful. Now, maybe that's a question you've got. If it isn't a question that you've got, it will be a question lots of other people have. Quite a few years ago as a church, we did if you could ask God one question, we did a kind of survey, people asked their friends. This question, over half the people in the response on the survey were asking a question around suffering. So it is a question that people have. And I am aware as we think about this, so there are two different approaches to it. One is the kind of philosophical head objection to suffering. That is, well, because of this, if there's suffering, he can't be both those things. I want to reject a God who's all loving and who's all powerful at a head level. And we can ask it that way, and that's a good way to ask it. But also there is the kind of asking it from the deep pain of experiencing suffering, asking it from the heart, so to speak. So there are lots of different angles we could talk about when thinking about this particular question of where is God in my suffering. I'm going to take one particular angle this evening. We can chat about more and take different angles in the question and answer, so yeah, do feel free to ask questions along different lines, either in the group altogether or come and chat to me afterwards as well. But what I want us to think about is, just set some premises, and then I'm going to split you into groups to discuss something, here's my assertions of what suffering's like in reality. And I think any answer's got to stack up with reality. So these are my assertions in there, so you might go, I don't agree with them, feel free to challenge them, but here's what I'm working from to say suffering, see there, feels wrong. So for us, when we suffer in the world, it feels wrong. So maybe a loved one dies, there's something that feels wrong about that. Particularly if they're very young, maybe a baby does, it feels wrong. That's one aspect I'm going to put forward to use as a premise. We might want to challenge that, but that's one of the premises I'm going to put forward. The second is suffering has two aspects to it. There's both deserved aspects and undeserved aspects. And so there may be things like, if I were to get drunk, get in my car, break the law of the land, drink, drive, crash my car, then get arrested and go to prison, I would be deservedly suffering for what I have done. But there is an undeserved element, isn't there? If when I do that, I crashed into someone else and knocked them down, they would be suffering undeservedly. So as we kind of grapple with this, there's a couple of different elements around suffering, both deserved and undeserved. So as we grapple with the answer, I think the answer we're going to come to is got to stack up with reality. Now, I'm going to go through in a moment just some of the general worldviews in suffering to talk about them, and then split you into groups to consider them. And I'm partly going to do that because I want to say that Christianity has some answers to this question. It won't answer every question, but I think it has a lot going for it in what it can answer, so that we can, well, maybe trust the things that we can't answer. And I want to compare that to some of the other worldviews around suffering, because actually if there's a better answer, we want to go with the best answer, but I want to see how they compare in their answers to it. So here it is. Don't worry about the fancy terms, all right? Don't worry about the fancy terms too much. This is I've taken these from Tim Keller's book on suffering. It's an excellent book to read. Let me just briefly run through these, and then what I'm going to get you is to, in your groups, just have a discussion. I appreciate some of your groups are quite big. And very sensible. If you've got a pillar in the way, step out, take a photo, and discuss it. Very good thinking on that. Is to split in your groups, or if your groups are too big, split up into kind of 4s or whatever number to discuss it, about where you find maybe these appealing or where you find them not persuasive. So let me just briefly run through this. The moralistic, this is essentially you suffer because you do bad things. And I've kind of already hinted on one element of that. The kind of, if you drink drive, you crash a car, you get arrested, there's a moralistic element. And so how should you live to avoid suffering? Do good, and then you'll avoid that suffering. There's a self-transcendent view, which Buddhism is one example of that. And that is suffering as an illusion. So your problem is, if you're suffering, is you're too attached to worldly things. If you detach yourself from those worldly things, then suffering won't be able to touch you. Then there's a fatalistic view, of which Islam has quite a large element of this as a worldview, which says, look, we don't understand what's going on. You've just got to trust God with what you can't understand it, so you've got to trust God. I hope I'm not unfairly representing that. There's certainly a large element of that, and as I've spoken to Muslims about it, they would certainly put that view forward. Christianity has an element of that, so we've got to recognise that as well. Then there's the view that there's a dualism. Now this is Star Wars style of there are forces of good, forces of evil in the world. They're battling it out for supremacy. You haven't got one with complete supremacy over the other, and therefore suffering exists basically because the universe is at war. And that's the reason why you've got suffering. And then you've got the secular version, which is where you don't have a God in the picture at all. The world has come about through accident, and therefore suffering is just the way it is. And so how do you respond to that? You just go, it is what it is, suck it up in that. We try and do what we can to minimise suffering. Now what I want to do is you just split into groups, kind of discussion, just have a chat around these. I'll leave those up on the screen there, of going, is there another major view that you think, hang on, you've missed a major view there? So do feel free to share that back afterwards. Anything major missed, what do you make of those explanations in terms of their appeal for how we view suffering? So we're going to give a few minutes in groups to do that. Go for it. Can you just pause the video? Great, all right. I'm not expecting you to have got complete spotlight of all the different worldviews on suffering in that particular time. I don't spend too long going through. I'm actually going to talk through each of these in a moment. I'm particularly interested in, are there, where people thought, well, this is a major other view of suffering that's not mentioned there other than those and the Christian worldview. Was anyone coming up with anything there at all?
Karma?
Go on.
I don't know. I don't know a lot about it, but there's that phrase, isn't it? You know, where wrong's done.
So I think I'd put that under moralistic.
Okay.
Of
right, yeah.
So what do you do? Karma is you kind of come around, and if you do good, you'll do well. If you do badly, you'll get your comeuppance type thing. So I think it's good to throw in there. I'd probably classify it under the moralistic. Great. I mean, hopefully it captures. I partly throw that out at this point because someone might go, "Hang on, you're not really engaging with a particular area." I think this does, with all the different major views with that. What I want to do is I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then we'll leave plenty of time for discussion and question and answer at the end. Let me talk through some of these, particularly taking what I set out at the start of. If we're engaging with reality, there's an element which suffering feels wrong, and the element is both deserved and undeserved. So that's what I experience in the world. So how do those major views stack up with some of the ways we experience suffering? And I partly want to do that because when I lay out the Christian view of where is God in my suffering, there may still be objections that we've got to that. There's things that are not answered, and I will say, yes, that's right. We don't have the answers to everything. We have the answers to something, but when it comes to suffering, I don't think we can go, okay, there's a few things that are unanswered with Christianity, therefore I'm going to reject that and will not have an alternative view to go to. So I want to be laying out some of the alternative views to see which is the best, therefore which one has the most going for it. So on the moralistic, you suffer because you're doing bad things. I mean, I pretty much already laid that one out. Like, there is something in that. That does happen. There are elements of which we live in a moralistic world. I do wrong, and I suffer for it. But the world's not, that's a very kind of flat view, isn't it? Because we see the kind of nature of, there is undeserved suffering as well. It's not an entirely moralistic universe that we experience at this particular point in time. So it explains deserved suffering, it doesn't explain undeserved suffering. What about the self-transcendent Buddhism, suffering as an illusion? I confess on some of these, I am no expert around this, and so if you think you've really not kind of set out a fair account of what Buddhists believe about this, I'm very happy to be corrected on that. But I just want to question some of that, of suffering coming from the fact that I just haven't detached myself from the things of the world. Because as I live in the world, it seems a natural thing to live, to try and love, and therefore if I love, I will suffer when a loved one is no longer around. And I'm not quite sure, they might have an answer to this, but how do you say, for a child suffering in poverty, what is it they're supposed to detach from for it to work in that, for them not to suffer? I don't think it works at the experiential level of, well, they need food, actually, in their poverty, and so I can't avoid suffering if I'm a child in poverty in that way. On the fatalistic side of things, as I said, Islam has an element of this. There's a bit of going, we don't understand the universe, trust the God who understands the universe, and therefore you just got to accept the way it is. Now, I'm going to return to this because there is an element of this in Christianity, but you do need something to go on, don't you? Because you could argue this you could create your own world religion that kind of makes a whole lot of stuff up and goes, you don't get it, it's not consistent, it doesn't work, but you don't know, you've got to trust the one who knows much more than you. There needs to be an element in which you can back it up and give us enough to go on that we can trust it. So how do you distinguish between Islam, that has an element of this, Christianity, that has an element of this? What is there to go on? So I want to say there is something in that, but you do need enough to back it up, that you've got something to trust in to then trust God with the things that you can't trust. On the dualistic side of things, the Star Wars style, battling it out in the universe, I think my biggest question with that is, well, who's battling it out? How do we work that out? And how on earth do we make sense of where the universe came from in the first place? And so lots of questions that there aren't very good answers for to get to that position. And it creates questions for us. If that were true, it's not very comforting. I think, where's it going? That isn't a reason that it isn't true if it's not very comforting, but it is a problem with the view. My biggest question is, how on earth do we get to that point? Who's battling it out? What is there to go on there? And then on the secular side of things, I guess this will be fairly common in our society. It's not very common across all of humanity, across all of time, but probably in the Western world at this particular point, quite a few people would hold to this. And this is where I want to say, look, people who hold this view probably wouldn't say this, the quote that I'm going to come up with, but it is where you end up with if you take this view to its logical conclusion, right? So here's a quote from Nietzsche from 1883, who heard about a natural disaster in Java and wrote, so there's a natural disaster, people have died, he wrote, "How magnificent." Now, I think that, obviously, with the aspect of suffering feels wrong, you can't say that's magnificent. We feel that it's wrong, but if you have a secular view that something's just the way it is, you can make a judgment call the other way and say that it's really good. And that's where I think the secular view actually is really problematic, because it doesn't fit with my experience. That suffering feels wrong. I want to say that as people are suffering, that feels wrong. It feels like it shouldn't be that way. And I think that is the biggest problem with that particular one, because we're not going, loved one dies, or how magnificent in response to that. We're feeling that deeply as a wrong thing in our world, that the secular view has no explanation, no explanatory power as to why that is. It's just the way it is. We don't see the animals responding the way human beings do we? So just laying out that the different views there, I think some of them are kind of, have problems on all the levels, on the parameters I've laid out in terms of the explanatory power for why there's suffering in the world. let's move on though to think about what about Christianity then? What about Christianity? And I hope you'll be able to bear with me. It's actually pretty hot, isn't it? I mean, this radiator is absolutely packing it out with heat. So I hope you're not as hot as I am, and we'll be able to bear with it as we go. So yeah, thanks Matt for opening a window on that. What about Christianity? Again, I want to say on this, it won't answer all our questions. It will hopefully answer some and help us in this whole area of it. So let's work through, and you might not go, hang on, why is he talking about this? It'll hopefully make sense and come together at the end as to why I'm saying the things that I'm saying around Christianity, because it starts with thinking about the whole explanation of where we've come from and where we're going. Now, this was my attempt at drawing a diagram, and it was a pretty poor one. I asked ChatGPT to tidy it up, and ChatGPT refused to tidy it up, so we're stuck with that. Don't worry too much about the squiggles on it. Essentially what it's saying here is, look, there's creation, and I put it up high, because right at the beginning of the Bible it says, creation, God creates the world, and it is good. The world is good. But then only a couple of chapters into the Bible, the first human beings have rebelled against God, and the world comes under a curse. It's often described as the fall, so it's going from the point of good, it falls down, and things are no longer good. And there is suffering in our world. Then you get right to the end of the Bible, and God says he will make things good again. Things will be good again. And in the middle bit, the really long middle bit, essentially is the account that we're given of God working to make things good again. And that all centers around the person of Jesus, his cross, his resurrection, who is working to make the world we live in, with all its current suffering, to make it better again. Now, as we think about that then, how does it answer the major objection that we were speaking about? If you remember, we were saying, look, actually, God's loving, he'd want to do something about suffering. If he's all-powerful, he could do something about suffering. And therefore the objection is, if I see suffering in the world now, God can't be loving and powerful at the same time because there is current suffering. How does it help with that objection? Well, this explanation in terms of the Bible where we're going is it says God is loving enough to care, because the person of Jesus is God, he's God, he takes on a human nature to come and die, and so he's loving enough to step into human history to do something about it, and shows he cares for humanity in their suffering. What about the powerful bit though? Well, do you notice he will do something about it in the end? He will do something about it in the end. We might question, well, is he powerful enough that he has to delay and he has to take his time to do it? I'm going to come on to talk about that. We see with this explanation is there's current suffering, but God is powerful enough to do something about it in the end. Now, what I want to do is we think about this, and particularly think about why is there suffering now? If God's going to do something about it in the end, why do we endure suffering now? Sure, it would be better to bring all the suffering to an end now. I'm going to think through a number of things, the Christian worldview, that explain why there is still suffering in the present, when God has acted to do something about it, and will at some point in the future bring it to an end. And that is to question some of our underlying assumptions. I don't know how well you can read those. I'll say them very clearly. You probably can't read them. And I'm just thinking, it was a mistake to let PowerPoint do the design for that with the yellow on the white and so on, but never mind. Hopefully you'll be able to at least hear me say these things. So the first one in the orange, a questionable assumption of our underlying assumption is we're entitled to a suffering-free life. So part of us goes, well, actually it's not right that I suffer in the here and now. Why would God allow that? There's an underlying assumption that I don't deserve to suffer in any way. But, as God sets up the world, he creates it, he creates us, he gives us life, I go my own way and I turn away from him and I reject his rule, why do I expect things to work out well? And why do I expect not to suffer? Now, some of the explanation that's sometimes given around this is down to human free will, that actually God gives us free will, we turn away from him, and therefore actually we turn into suffering. I don't want to say it's all down to that, because I'm not sure the Bible says it's all down to that. God has a level of control in that, but he does give us a certain amount of free will, and therefore as we turn away from him and we do things that inflict suffering on our world, why do we think we're entitled to a suffering-free life? So the idea I deserve better when I don't follow God and write him off is a questionable one, that I think I deserve better in our world. Now, there are questions still to answer. There are questions still around some people suffer a lot more than others, some very undeserved suffering in that. There's questions still to answer on why God in his power allows things to go on, but there is some aspect. Suffering now is partly deserved for the way we have rejected God and living in his world. I'm not entitled to a suffering-free life. Second thing then is, there are no possible, this is the yellow one, you might not be able to read that, there are no possible good reasons for allowing suffering. So it assumes that there can be no situation where it is a good thing that suffering takes place. Now, again, I think this is a questionable assumption. I'm not sure that is the case. I've used this in the Job series, of the injection that you might get if you're suffering at the time, but it's suffering, short-term pain, or longer-term gain, maybe to give in a vaccination or something like that. Sometimes we might understand that, and sometimes we might not. Sometimes we might be the little child who needs the vaccination, but just doesn't understand why they're just being kind of prodded with a needle that is painful in that. And so, I think, again, a questionable assumption, there are no possible good reasons for allowing suffering. I think there are, and that comes with a little bit of humility of us not necessarily knowing what those reasons are. Thirdly then, there are no possible good reasons why God delays the rescue. So that's a questionable assumption. No reasons why God delays the rescue. And I think this is where the Bible, I've got a Bible verse there which I'll read in a moment, the Bible gives us reason for the delay. Why we live in a time now where Jesus has come, he's died, he's risen, he's won the rescue, but God doesn't bring our suffering world to an end, to the new creation where there will be no more suffering. And that is because we've gone our own way. So God created the world, he's created us, but we've lived in this world ignoring him. And if God took us all now to be with him in a new creation, and we live with that rebellious attitude, well, the new creation wouldn't be very good for very long in that. And so currently, as it stands, there are a couple of problems. One is, I don't deserve to be part of it. The second is, as I am, I'll mess it up again. And so I'll be excluded from it. But what God does is his rescue plan is to deal with those very problems. So that what he'll do is he'll rescue me, and Jesus dies on the cross to pay my punishment so that my guilt is dealt with and I'm made fit for heaven. He also changes me that when that new creation comes, I will be made perfect so it won't get messed up again for all who follow Jesus. But it does require us to respond to his rescue plan. And so the delay is the 2 Peter 3 verse 9, and this is all about the promise of God coming back to right the world, and people are saying, because he's not come back yet, he's never coming back. Here's what Peter writes, which is part of the Bible in God's words. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. He is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. Do you see what it's saying there? It's actually saying, look, as each day goes by, God has not brought the suffering in our world to an end, to give those of us who haven't turned to Jesus the chance to turn to him and know that hope. Because with that Bible overview, what I was missing from it is it's not the new creation up here for everyone. Actually, if we're not trusting in Jesus, it's the kind of downhill path. And ultimately we'll stand before God in judgment, found wanting, and life in eternity will be worse. And so God's giving us the option so that we don't have to experience the downhill part, we can experience the hope of a perfect new world. And what God does for us is in our suffering world is he gives us his word to highlight that to us. He also maybe might take us through some suffering to wake us up to that fact. Imagine if we just went through life and it went pretty swimmingly the whole time. We'd probably go, yeah, great, it all carries on, and we never think about things being any different to the suffering world we're in now and suffering feeling wrong. And then we're not aware of a world where we're striving for something better and we miss out on the rescue plan. C.S. Lewis, very famous quote, I'm sure you've heard it, says this: God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. He talks about suffering being his megaphone to a deaf world to wake us up that in the here and now, God is working to make it better, and suffering wakes us up to that. And it picks up some of the questionable assumptions that there's no reason for God delaying, and there's no good reason for suffering, but there is good reason to wake us up to a rescue plan, to know the hope of a much better life, and God delays coming back now to allow other people to put their trust in Jesus. And so if you haven't this evening, there's a chance tonight to do it, because Jesus hasn't come back yet to end our world. If you were converted within the last 5 years, God didn't come back 5 years ago to allow you to be part of that new great rescue. And so what the Christian worldview does is it deals with the objection, saying, look, God's loving and he is powerful, and he will bring suffering to an end. He's acted in history. Jesus has come and died and risen again to bring it to an end. But actually we still live now in a world. And God's not aloof. He's not aloof in that. He's loving enough to send Jesus to die to rescue us. And the reason he hasn't brought it all to an end, he could do in his power at this very moment if he wanted to. But the reason is to do something in us in our suffering, to wake us up to our world is not as it should be, and to our hope of a world where it will be like that, that we might turn and receive his rescue plan. Now, what I want to assert around that then is that Christian worldview of suffering, I think, has quite a lot of explanatory force. I'm not saying it answers all of our questions, but I think it explains why suffering feels wrong and unnatural. And that is because in our Bible overview, the world was created good, and we have that inbuilt sense of wanting it to be good and wanting it to be good again. And so it feels wrong because we're not at that point. We now live in a current world where there is suffering, so it makes sense of that feeling. It also explains why suffering is both moralistic and non-moralistic. So that the fact of, yeah, I do reap what I sow in a world. It's built in moralistic of, as I do wrong, I will suffer for that, but not necessarily immediately in it. So I live in this world where I reap a bit of what I sow, not necessarily straight away. I also live in a world where I reap what others sow. God will bring all of that justice in the end. There will be justice in the end. And so ultimately the universe is moralistic. There's just a time delay on that. And that makes sense of how in the world there can be deserved suffering and undeserved suffering, both happening as we experience life now. Now, that's what you find as the Christian worldview in the Bible. And I think that does stack up with the way I experience the world and stack up with reality. And so why does God allow suffering? Well, we've gone our own way, but God will bring good out of it, and he acts to rescue, he acts to end suffering for all those who will come and receive Jesus. And that can make sense of the way we experience suffering. Now, I've got a few more bits to say, but what I want us to do at that point is just break up into our groups and just consider that for a moment of how persuasive do you find that as an explanation of the way the world is, maybe compared to the other worldviews that we were talking about a little bit earlier on. Do that for a few minutes, and then we'll finish up and have a time for question and answers. Great. What I want to do is just finish up for a couple of minutes, give you some more time in your group, and then we'll go to question and answer with everyone. I don't know how you got into your conversations, or we can pick some of that up in the question and answer as to, how much do you feel it does make sense of the world, that the Christian worldview compared to other versions. I guess what I say with the Christian worldview is there's an element in which there is a certain amount, we are given some answers I don't know kind of what proportion you would give it, but we're given some answers. We're not given the answer to everything. There will be questions that we have around this area of suffering that we don't have. And in that particular aspect, Christianity is fatalistic in the sense of going, well, actually, we've got to trust God with the things we can't understand. Again, for those of you who've been following the series in Job, one of the chapters was Job 28, where we're saying we're limited as human beings, therefore we cannot understand all of the intricacies of the universe, but God does. And so trust Him with the things we cannot understand, and trust that He's good and we have enough to go on. And I guess just as I finish and just say, look, we don't have the answers to everything, but we do have the answers that we need, and we have enough to go on. And just as I finish, we might go, well, isn't that a little bit wishful thinking? Yeah, this is laid out, but what actually do we have to go on? Well, I think the one thing we do have is a very coherent worldview around this that has more going for it than any other view, particularly in this area of suffering. But actually, where's our proof in this? What have we got to go on that suggests it's not wishful thinking? That is the person of Jesus. The accounts we have of Him coming down into the world, the historical accounts around His existence, and we get glimpses of what He was able to do. He says He was bringing in His kingdom, and what did He do? He went round healing people who were sick, overcoming some of the suffering. And He showed that He had power to reverse it in the accounts that we have of Jesus, and all the historical evidence around His death and His resurrection back to life to show that He'd beaten death. There is something to go on. It's not like we believe in reincarnation with not much evidence around that. There's historical proof around the person of Jesus who existed in history and around the explanation of Him rising from the dead in history. And so in the person of Jesus, we have something to go. We have a lot to go on to be able to trust in the one who can overcome suffering, who points us to the fact that it will be brought to an end, and that in Him, we can trust in the things, therefore, that we don't have the explanations to. Trust Him with what we cannot understand. And so just let me wrap up here. Where is God in my suffering? He is in control. He's powerful. He's powerful enough to do something about it. He's loving. He does care for us in our suffering. He's loving enough that Jesus came into the world to die to rescue us. He's risen again to life and promises to take all who trust in Him to that new world where there won't be any more suffering. And in the present promises to sustain us until that comes again. So I don't think it's wishful thinking. We have something to go on to be able to trust God with our unanswered questions. Just for a few moments then in your groups, just think through. You can carry on chatting if you didn't finish your discussions on any of the other areas. Has anything in particular struck you? What questions, challenges do you still have? Chat about that in your groups for a few minutes, and then we'll do question and answer all together.